Hey all, here OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a closer look at the HIFI WALKER H20 Ultra. This is their newest high-res audio certified flagship player here in 2025, and it actually can be found on sale currently for around $225. Coming in two colors, silver or this matte black version over here. So a little more pricey than some of their previous players that we've seen last year, including their H2, which has been very popular as kind of an iPod-esque digital audio player that has a scroll wheel on the front. And some of these players have recently gained the functionality to support Rockbox, an alternative operating system if you want to customize the way that the UI looks. Compared to some of these touchscreen players might be missing that, but they are packing in higher end components. For example, this H2 has only a single 3.5mm headphone jack, compared to the Ultra also packing in a 4.4mm balanced audio jack, larger to drive higher impedance headphones, more powerful studio headphones, in addition to the more common 3.5mm standard. And furthermore, it is using an upgraded DAC or digital to analog converter chip, which can technically produce slightly higher quality audio output if you are a more discerning listener or audiophile, which also uses a slightly older Bluetooth chip compared to the Ultra here, supports LDAC, which was missing on the H2. Now I will say that we also checked out at the same time their H20 Pro last year as well, which previously was their highest end flagship player, but now can be found at a slightly lower price point. So this is going to be around $40 less compared to the newest Ultra, and I will say that side by side you can see that difference in size, although they definitely come from the same family, with a brass accented dial on the side, in addition to having plenty of controls, including the same status LED light, power, as well as skip track and play pause commands. And it also supports, of course, a micro SD card to expand on the built-in memory, in addition to using standard USB Type-C. And in terms of storage, in the packaging you will get a 128GB micro SD card, and it supports memory cards up to 1 TB if you want to further augment the storage. So aside from a slightly larger 4-inch touchscreen display compared to 3.2 inches on the Pro, some other differences with the Ultra would include also a slightly upgraded DAC, digital to analog chip inside, supporting FPGA native DSD256, and also using a dual amp architecture that can provide resolution up to 768 kHz at 32-bit audio. In comparison, the previous model was using the ES9038Q2M, which technically has slightly weaker signal to noise ratio, and the newer chip on this device has slightly improved dynamic range, although they're roughly based on the same architecture for the chips. Now, speaking of the FPGA technology, so let's say you have an audiobook or giant music file which spans multiple hours. This will ensure more precise second-per-second playback that is synchronized with the audio track. And that is compared to the majority of more budget players, including smartphones that we have, are instead using the ASIC standard or integrated circuit. So FPGA options like these players are going to be more expensive to manufacture, but can have some advantages when it comes to synchronization of audio and having low latency. Further dissecting the jargon, kind of mumbo jumbo if you're not an audiophile, what does the DSD number mean? Well, specifically with DSD64, which by the way is the maximum that the H2 kind of iPod style player was able to reach, provided you with up to 64 times of CD's audio sampling rate. Compared to on the Ultra, we have again DSD256, so now over 256 times of a CD's audio sampling rate, which is impressive from a hardware point of view. That being said, for the average person, are they able to hear the difference between DSD64 versus 256? I would argue it's actually a lot tougher to discern as you're listening to them side by side, and even so, it's not necessarily going to be night and day apart. Again, the analogy I made earlier to pixel peeping kind of applies here as well. You do have to really be listening extremely closely. Maybe you're working in music industry, you're into music production, listening to studio albums and dissecting those tiny details apart, and then perhaps having a tool like this might be valuable, or of course if you are obsessed or super passionate about music. But if you're in the middle of the spectrum, then the difference may seem less significant for a casual consumer. For example, a person using a Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 versus a 8 Elite chip, they both feel extremely fast in most day-to-day use. So it is something to think about, especially since some of these codecs are already starting to surpass, I would argue, the limit of almost human human hearing. I mean, yes, it's still impressive on paper, but yeah, the Ultra comes stacked with pretty much upgrades in all of the components, including audio codecs that we talked about, and a slightly larger chassis that kind of reminds me of some Sony Walkman players, to be completely honest. Now again, because it is an FPGA powered player, it does not run on Android or any mobile operating system. It is a proprietary OS, similar to what we saw on their Pro as well. Final top-line specs here, again, file format support, pretty much everything across the board can be played just fine, and one thing to keep in mind here is the player itself, again, the audio chip is very high-end, but to get you the best listening experience, you have to ensure that all the components in the music listening flow is of a similar quality to get you the best experience. For example, your audio track can't be just a super heavily compressed MP3 that you're pulling from somewhere. Then obviously you're not going to hear the biggest difference. If you pair it with a slightly higher quality audio recordings, something like FLAC, which is lossless resolution, for example, plus also using higher end headphones with more impressive speakers or drivers inside, then the combination of those pieces in addition to the player itself is going to give you a more satisfying listening experience. In other words, audio quality is only as good as its weakest link. So just keep that in mind when it comes to headphones and the music tracks that you're pairing it with as well. You'll be able to take advantage of those IEM's larger studio style headphones, which is why many audiophiles and hi-fi enthusiasts still swear by wired headphones to this day. So you get that, of course, I/O present here. It's crafted out of machined aluminum, feeling quite hefty and premium. Now, by the way, it can be used as a USB DAC as well, also functioning as a Bluetooth receiver as well. So what that means is if you want to connect this to your computer, you can actually use it as an external sound card for audio to pass through the higher end DAC of the player. If your computer, for example, doesn't pack in very good audio, you can use it as a wired DAC for pass-through mode, in addition to wirelessly connecting it to a smartphone if you're listening to audio that way, in addition to, of course, using it as a dedicated music player of its own. Now, taking a closer look at the packaging contents here first, before we dive into the UI and performance, aside from the player itself, pretty standard USB Type-C cable here for charging as well as data transfer. The battery inside is 3000 milliamp hours and it's rated for around 36 hours of audio playback in the wired mode. With Bluetooth on, that number is a little closer to around 30 hours in my testing, but still seems to be pretty strong. By the way, the H2 from before with a scroll wheel did have a smaller size, and so the battery capacity was also a little more limited, instead getting around the range of 15 to 20 hours of audio playback, at least in the wired mode for me. So this is going to be a little stronger in terms of power endurance. It's not too surprising for a larger size device as well. Now you will also find another spare screen protector, and the front and back of the player, by the way, are crafted out of tempered glass. I do like the kind of carbon fiber finish going on the rear here, making it look a little more fancy. We also get just a standard quick user guide in addition to a pouch if you're trying to take it with you when on the go. So overall, I do like the hardware of this player, and even though it is a little more bulky compared to the previous Pro and the H2, it still is, of course, going to be smaller in overall dimensions versus most typical smartphones in this day and age, which have at least a 6.4 to 6.5 inch screen, if not larger. So even though this thing is not the slimmest player in the world, it can still fit, I would say, relatively easily into a pocket, and you are able to control things using the physical buttons, giving you that sense of tactility if you don't want to rely on the touchscreen 100% of the time. Though if we had to be very nitpicky, technically some of these sharper corners and edges, just be a little bit more careful as you're gripping onto it. It can dig into your palms a little bit more compared to the more rounded design of the Pro. Instead might be a little bit more ergonomic for holding, but nonetheless, I think that it works well enough here. So taking a closer look at the software experience next, again, this IPS LCD screen is relatively colorful and offers decent viewing angles. It is a fully laminated panel. Otherwise, we can check out on the very top here the volume level that you're able to adjust just using the, again, crown key or dial, and you can also see time and date as well as battery settings. And we can also swipe onto the right to check out the currently playing back track, including cover art support, and also the widgets, including the icon for music, also changes to the cover art of the currently playing song. But there are no additional real extras on here. It really is focusing exclusively on music playback, and that's it. There is no video playback mode, for example, nor do you get extras like an FM radio, games, things like that we perhaps saw on an iPod Touch. But again, this thing is really designed for more exclusive, again, audiophile-centric music listening, and since it is using a proprietary OS based on that FPGA hardware, I guess we can't expect the same level of functionality as on an Android or iPhone. But in a way, it is quite minimalist. It's trying to do one thing and do it really well instead of being kind of a jack of all trades. Although I think a few extras wouldn't hurt. We have access to a pretty simple file structure if you want to navigate contents inside of your memory card, for example. Pretty self-explanatory. The UI doesn't have a ton of animations. It's relatively responsive enough to operate. You can tap on the star icon to basically add this under that particular subfolder of love, and you'll see that song then added over. In addition to taking a look at artist name that you can also sort through instead. Again, sorted alphabetically by default, and you can use the slider to jump more quickly through specific letters that the track here starts with. Although there isn't really a universal search bar. I think that would have been also a convenient addition. Perhaps they can consider in a future, maybe firmware update, being able to type in with a keyboard since it has a much larger screen on this device. Could be nice if you have thousands and thousands of songs. And then under Playback over here, you can also take a look at either looping, shuffling the songs that you're playing, as well as activate the equalizer. By default, it's actually turned off here, but you can go into some genre-specific settings, including rock, classical music, jazz, pop, dance, vocal, acoustic, blues, and metal. In addition to a custom EQ slider can also be found for further tweaking the sound based on your preferences, and then saving it as a preset. Further scrolling down gives us more granular controls. For example, gapless playback, you can turn this on or off when you are going between different tracks, in addition to a crossfade effect as it kind of slowly turns down the volume before ramping it up again at the next song, making more of a subtle transition if you prefer that, or if you want something more clean, in addition to resume from the last track that you were playing, which might be more useful if you're listening to an audiobook that has hundreds of chapters inside. It will remember your place, in addition to saving the device's volume level every time that you're turning the player on or off, since this player has plenty of power to again drive even larger headphones. So if you find the volume output to be too shocking at the 100% volume, it's almost deafening, you can of course turn it down a little bit to prevent any hearing loss, and it will cap out at the maximum threshold that you set for yourself. So you can further control some of these properties, again, gain settings as well, if you're looking for this level of granularity. Now coming back to the music playback layout, to go through a random shuffle or loop playback options, and under the three dots here, you can also add it to your own playlist, generating one for your favorite songs, check out additional track information if available, so on and so forth. And now, format of the file, whether it's an MP3 or FLAC, as well as the kilobits per second for the audio track, is also going to be shown down below there. So this is going to be a FLAC recording instead, 24-bit, and you can see that there's really no problems in terms of playing it back. Scrubbing between parts of the track was also relatively fast and speedy as well. Now, as far as audio quality is concerned, obviously that's the most important part of any kind of hi-fi DAC or digital audio player, and I'm glad to report that indeed it was giving me very clean and nuanced audio reproduction, courtesy of the relatively high quality DAC chip that they're using inside. And the thing is, most of these hi-fi players are designed to give you a more neutral listening experience. It's not super colored. For example, it wants it to be as faithful to the original sound and recording as possible. By default, it is going to be fairly well balanced. It's not like the bass is going to be out of control or anything like that. But again, that will slightly depend based on the type of headphones you're pairing it with. But what I can say is that the connectivity here has been extremely solid. There is no traces of any distortion at all. I was listening extremely closely, even cranking the volume almost down to 1, and still was not able to hear any hissing, any humming, anything like that. No digital distortion. Paired with your favorite headphones, I would say the overall music experience is definitely super detailed. It's nuanced, layered, and you can get easily sucked and immersed into the music that you're listening to, with excellent sonic reproduction as well as dynamic range for audio, which I would dare say rivals some of the best DAPs that are available on the market from brands like Sony Walkman, for example. That being said, again, is it a night and day difference versus the Pro from previously? I would say that is a much more difficult question to answer. So for around $30, $40 more, I would argue that you're primarily getting this one for the slightly larger screen size, but keep in mind they're mostly used for music playback exclusively, and a smaller device might fit in even more easily into a pocket. So yes, if you're coming from a normal smartphone, I would say you can definitely hear more of the difference versus a higher quality DAP like this when it comes to richness, detail, dynamic range, which are all much appreciated. However, if you're already coming from a hi-fi player already, then that's where the difference or gap is going to seem a little more minor. Now, finally, if we jump into settings here, you can also change the system language. Here's all the available options at a glance, as well as you can tap here to update the music database if you have a new memory card that you popped in for it to kind of refresh there. And then under UI themes, you're able to slightly change the way that some of the icons and fonts are being displayed, some of the icon packs if you want it to pop a little bit more. And here's one more theme, which is called Street, also gives you some oversized keys to play with. So it gives you a little bit of flexibility when it comes to customization. Maybe this one is a little more inspired by the iOS icons from iPods of yesteryear. Font size can also be changed from smaller versus larger. And for screensaver, you can also set it to be a clock when it times out after a couple of seconds. For example, looking something like this, relatively simple and straightforward. And the screensaver clock or cover art can also act as kind of a lock screen. So if you want to prevent any accidental touches in your pocket, you can activate this feature and kind of slide to unlock to go back into this main screen. And you can also swipe up as well, in addition to swiping from the side. Power percentage can also be visualized here on the top corner, as well as brightness of the screen, which generally speaking, I wouldn't say it's too problematic for most use cases. Unless you're in direct sunlight, then you may have to shade the screen a little bit more, but not bad. Timeout settings, as well as time and date settings, can also be set from here as well, including the ability to choose between 12 versus 24-hour format. Sleep timer here is also available up to 120 minutes, so if you're listening in bed, it will then turn off after you drift off into sleep, as well as a very basic quote-unquote ebook mode. I've always thought this to be kind of a strange addition to players that have a IPS LCD screen. It would be a different story if it had a e-ink screen instead, then perhaps to reduce eye strain, then you might enjoy reading on a Kindle-like experience. But since this is very similar to a smartphone display, I've always felt it was a little bit strange. But if you had a few text files, maybe important backup pieces of info that you want to quickly reference, you can see it under this tab. Now finally, under USB mode here, you can also go between data transfer, charging only, as well as USB DAC options, so that when you're connecting it to your computer, it's able to switch back and forth. And the UI also supports some swipe gestures from the side of the screen to go back by one page, which is pretty easy to use. Now under the Bluetooth toggle here, you can also go into the codec toggle, which I do appreciate. So you can manually switch between standards like LDAC, as well as the typical SBC, AAC, in addition to aptX, based on your preferences. Now LDAC is going to give you the highest quality audio using Bluetooth. Up to 3 times more detail can be sent compared to normal SBC and AAC standards, and then aptX is kind of the next best option. However, keep in mind that the more data that you're sending wirelessly, it's also going to draw a little bit more power. Now, something I will say though is this particular player does not seem to have built-in Wi-Fi connectivity. And for some strange reason, the H20 Pro actually did come with built-in Wi-Fi, as you can see here, which can be used for wireless data transfer, receiving songs using this instead of the wired method or using the micro SD card. So I'm not really sure why Wi-Fi capability was actually cut on the Ultra player, despite it being the more expensive, newer device. Furthermore, the H20 Pro had an extra setting under the advanced menu here, which allowed you to double tap to wake up the screen. Of course, you can disable this function if you're not using it. For example, double tapping like this to quickly wake it up. Compared to on the Ultra, it's actually missing that particular software setting or mode. Again, slightly curious that they're cutting a couple of these features on the newer device. Although there is, again, Bluetooth DAC mode, so you can connect to your smartphone and use it as a wireless DAC to supplement whatever music is being played in terms of the source from your smartphone. So for instance, if you have Spotify or Apple Music on your phone, you can just play it back and then have the audio come out from the HIFI WALKER Ultra over here. And also, if you are pairing this thing with an iPhone, then you can also leverage codecs like the aforementioned LDAC, which are technically missing on iPhones by default, because that was developed initially by Sony, available typically for just Android smartphones. So it's a way to add in some of those audio codecs that are typically missing for iPhones, having that two-way connectivity. Now, if you download the HiFi Music application available for iOS and Android devices, which is basically a music player app available for your smartphone that has a similar layout with the kind of yellow accents as we see on this player, you can also access the link functionality, opening up the camera. Perhaps it's hooked up to a home theater and it's harder for you to control things without walking around. You can use your phone instead to talk with the player as kind of a remote functionality, as long as it's within the Bluetooth range of around 10 meters from one another. So yeah, I can say that in the USB as well as Bluetooth DAC modes also worked without too many problems. Connectivity felt relatively stable in the wireless Bluetooth mode as well, connecting to headphones. Didn't really have any disconnections with good enough signal strength as long as I was within the range of roughly roughly 10 meters of the device. So that is more or less it as far as our hands-on closer look at the HIFI WALKER, the H20 Ultra. Again, this is their newest DAP, digital audio player, and further upgrades some of the components. That being said, it still is again 100% catered specifically for music, like most of these FPGA-based players, so it further completes the lineup of devices from this brand. Again, if audio quality is going to be your top criteria at the very least. You can check out more details if you're interested in a player like this in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been just a closer look at the HIFI WALKER H20 Ultra.